Can you talk to me a little bit more about the new natural law that you mentioned?
Yeah, it is an understanding. It's based on an interpretation of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, talks about the first principles of practical reason being self-evident and not derived, and he identifies them as directives of practical reason. I mean, Aquinas thinks that reason can operate in two ways. It can operate in terms of trying to understand the way that the world is, or it can be directed towards action, right? And we talked about that a little bit earlier. And when
Mm,
it's directed towards action, it directs persons, right? Agents, people who are acting towards action by its directive to them to pursue certain goods, right? For Aquinas lists the good of life, good of knowledge, good of friendship. Um, I think that if you properly read his text, he identifies the good of marriage as a basic good, good of religion.
mm,
And that's the starting point, right? That is its practical reasons, self-evident grasp of these goods as to be done and pursued,
mhm,
right? That is the starting point for human action. And then Aquinas is a little bit, I would say, unclear about how you get from there to moral norms. He does think that the norms of the Ten Commandments are derived from these first principles, these directives to pursue human goods in a very quick way that should be obvious to more or less everybody. And then he thinks that further down the road, there are other precepts that are precepts that only the wise could grasp. But he doesn't say a lot about how we get from those directives to pursue goods like life and friendship to commandments like the commandment not to kill or the commandment not to lie.
mm,
And I think one of the ways that we can do that, again, thinking about this from the standpoint of what does it mean to be reasonable, is to recognize, again, because of our fallen human nature, that very frequently we're led in the direction of acting on the basis of emotions or passions or desires that we have that aren't really well integrated with reason. And
mm,
so if I was to act out of hostility to you and kill you for no reason, that would obviously be unreasonable. It would be
mhm,
contrary to the good. But I think it's also unreasonable for me to kill you in order to achieve some other purpose, right? Not out of hostility, but because I'm trying to pursue some other good. And I
mm,
think it would also be unreasonable because it would fail to recognize the way in which these goods are goods, not just for me, but for you and for anybody who's relevantly like us. If I was to systematically privilege my pursuit of the goods over everybody else's,
mm.
or the pursuit of me and my family over everybody else's, right? And
Yeah.
so I think a reasonable pursuit of the good has to be fair and has to be, in a very general sense, in pursuit of communion between all the beings that are capable of being fulfilled by these goods.
Hmm.
So that, I mean, I would say that the new natural law, the characteristic position of the new natural law with respect to morality is this grasp of the goods as directing us towards action, and then
Right.
an attempt to fill in how we get from that to moral principles like thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not lie or bear false witness. And one of the ways that we think that's helpful for doing that is by identifying very concretely the way that passions and desires that aren't integrated into reason can lead us away from what reason requires.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's an interesting. Where did Aquinas base? Did he just base the goods off of like when looking at society and history, we can see things that worked and that produced human flourishing, and so we mark that as a good, or did he have something else that he based it on?
Well, that's the interpretive question, right? There's the dispute right there. Some people think that Aquinas has a view according to which you look at human nature. I think that what Aquinas is suggesting in this particular passage, where he's talking about the first principles, is that if we think about how you and I came to understand that it's better to have friends than not to have friends, right? Or that it's better to be knowledgeable than to be ignorant,
Mm.
or that it's better to be a person whose various practical aspects of ourself are kind of tied together rather than coming
Right.
apart all the time, right? We have in ourselves certain inclinations, Aquinas says, towards finding things out and towards, you know, communion with other persons. Um, and as we come to mature reflection on these, we can recognize the objects of these inclinations as both general and intelligible, right? So not just I'd like to be friends with you or I'd like to know the answer to this particular question, but I recognize friendship as a
Right.
good, right? I recognize knowledge as a good, and I recognize it not just as a good for me, but as a good for you and a good for all other human beings. So I think Aquinas is giving us a picture of how we come not to deduce these goods, but to have a kind of insight, a kind of practical insight into what's genuinely fulfilling for human beings. Right? He
Yeah.
could be wrong. He could be wrong. I could be wrong in my interpretation of Aquinas, but I think it's plausible, right? I do think that you see this in children that they come to have insight into these broader categories of goods, and they stop simply thinking about this particular thing or that particular thing, and come to have a more general understanding of what's worthwhile.
Right.
Friendship is something they start to want to be friends with not just the people that they are familiar with, but with they recognize this would be a good if I became friends with this person at school or even with that stranger.
I do like the fact that he was looking at this saying, like, if you look at the world, the Bible tells us that you can find God in it, and you can find this objective clues about the objective morality. Right? We fundamentally know that I shouldn't murder you. That stealing your property is wrong. Right? There's something ingrained within us. We have factory settings, and I like that Thomas Aquinas was. Starting with those and starting with these are the things we know that have worked on that have worked throughout history. I think that's very wise. I wonder though, is that something that only works in a reasonable society? In other words, if you look at a culture, a place, a people that have gone very far astray from what we would consider normative, from what we would consider good. Um, Pulling them back, I don't know if pulling them back by the strings of this is not your human nature would work. I'm curious what you think of that because um, I think fundamentally it has to be grounded in God because He is outside of the system, and all standards within the system can and will change over time.
Yeah, so Aquinas thinks that morality is a matter of reason, right? And he thinks that reason is available to us simply as human beings, right? He does think that in a corrupt culture, it can be very difficult for us to recognize what's true. I don't, he would never deny that.
Hmm.
But I think he thinks that even in the most corrupt culture, right, there's still some opportunity for people to be brought around to the truth, right? Which is one of the reasons I think that if you look at Aquinas's writings, they're just chock full of argument, right? And he's given right. He's committed to the value of reason, and he's committed to the value of arguing from premises of natural reason when you're arguing with people, for instance, who aren't Christians, right? Who don't agree, who don't accept a set of
Right.
Christian premises. I think that there's three possibilities here, where you mentioned two. One can
Okay.
try and, as it were, drag people back by way of reference to human nature. One can drag people back by reference to God. Or I think the third possibility, which is the one that I've been trying to articulate, is that one can, as it were, drag people back, right? One can make a pitch to people. One can engage in something that is practically convincing by appealing to their recognition of what's good, of what's fulfilling. I
Right.
think even amidst right many disagreements that we have, right. So again, to go back to the abortion case, right. I disagree with a lot of people, obviously, about this issue, but I
Yeah.
don't think that most of those people would deny that there's something valuable about life and about health,
Right.
right. Our disagreements are about whether early early human beings are in fact human beings, or whether early human beings deserve the same protections with regard to life, or in some cases about whether life itself is a basic human good, the way that I think it is, or whether it's only an instrumental good, right? So that
Hmm.
if it's not serving your other purposes, then it's no longer of any value. So I think there is some common ground there, even among people who have very significant disagreements. And I think Aquinas's counsel would be to argue from that common ground, right? To start there and then
Mm.
to make the case, right? And
Yeah.
that in a certain way, it's by doing that that we then get to this larger question of God. Right? If there really are goods for human beings, if there really is a way that human beings ought to act that is conducive to human flourishing, I think that raises a natural question. Well, where did that come from?
Right.
Right? And there's an avenue to then talk about larger issues about our relationship to the divine.
Yeah. I might just add one thing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And as a side note, God bless you for your work in fighting abortion. We are all the way behind that, 100%.
All right.
So well done there. Thank you for your work. Um, but I would maybe add one thing, which is I believe that sin. The Bible teaches that sin makes people blind.
Mhm.
And so they're in a way that they cannot appeal to reason, they cannot understand reason, they cannot. Um, if you if you serve reason, eventually it will betray you. But if you submit the reason to God, then the Bible says that He will give it back to you 10, 30, and 100-fold, right? And so this I think that this is very wise to appeal to everyone's base knowledge, the factory settings, that this is good, this other thing is bad, and you must obey that good. We would say because God um, because God commands it. But I might also add that when people are so deeply in sin that God has given them up to it, sometimes they can't see the hole that they're in.
Yeah, I guess, there's a little bit of a difference of emphasis between the way that you put it and the way that I would put it. And the difference of emphasis turns, I think, on this notion of obedience, right?
Mm,
I think obedience is not, as it were, the first step towards becoming a better person. It could be,
mm,
right? But I think a different first step is what I called earlier insight, right?
mm.
Recognizing, and I think we can see this in people's lives, right? Recognizing that the way that you're doing it is just not working out,
Yep,
right? That there's something stifling and insufficient about leading a life that is entirely directed at yourself and the satisfaction of your desires,
right,
or about treating other human beings merely as instruments for the sake of your own sense of entitlement, or doing what you happen to feel like now, right? Even if it's taking drugs and not doing anything of consequence, right? I mean, those lives have a way of making their vices apparent to the
yeah,
people leading them.
yeah,
And that seems to me that the insight that comes from that is an insight that's centered on the notion of fulfillment and flourishing rather than the notion of obedience. I
yeah.
think it can lead us, right, to want to be obedient,
Obedient, right,
right? When we see, oh my gosh, there's a being who loves me and has put me in this world out of love and has created a form of life that's available to me by which I can come to be the full person that I should be, right? I should certainly do what that being wishes me to do.
right.
But I'm not sure that I wouldn't think that that's always the starting point, and I think that in some cases, a more plausible starting point for people is recognition that their life is not going the way that
That it should. Yeah.
I will.
Can,
So can I tell you just a quick story that I mean that
go ahead.
I because I don't know how this came across the algorithm of my Instagram page, but because I'm not in any way a fan of this group, but I saw an interview with Duff McKagan, maybe his name is, the bassist for Guns N' Roses.
Oh, really?
Yes. Who talked about how, when he was 28, he thought that he was going to live to 30 and then die because all he did was spend all of his time drinking, right? And then one day his, I guess, pancreas burst and he almost died. And his mother, he found himself in the hospital, and his mother came in. She had Parkinson's disease. I think he's from a large family, and he said he described what happened. He said, I saw myself, as it were, from above the bed, and with my mother in her 70s with Parkinson's disease coming in to see what had happened to her son, and I thought to myself, this is not how it should be. I should be taking care of my mother.
Right.
Right. I should be taking care of myself. I should be taking care of other people. And he said from that moment on, he turned things around, right? He
Yeah.
had a recognition that the way of life, the form of life that he was leading was not in fact conducive to human fulfillment, however much it was satisfying his immediate desires. And it seems
Yeah.
to me that, that recognition was predicated on the kinds of goods that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Love, friendship, recognition of the value of life and health. So I think it's, he had a kind of Thomistic insight,
Right.
uh, presumably without describing it in that way.
Yeah. Kind of like a prodigal son moment,
It was a
where
prodigal son moment. Yeah.
you're in the pigsty and you realize this is
Oh
not where
goodness,
I
this
should
is
be.
not. Yeah, this is not.
Yeah.
Things are not working out.